a dreadful virus going around, and it has caused a major problem, not just in your country and where I'm living, but throughout the world. Some places like Australia are dealing with it much more successfully than others. And some places it's got completely out of control. And even now, when the worst of it is not over, the death rate and the number of people in hospitals is huge. What the outcome of this will be when it is finally over is hard to say, but certainly there are going to be many people as bad as that is. Once that's over, then that problem is solved, except for the grief and the sadness of those who, their relatives and loved ones. Then there's going to be the problem, the long-term problem of the economy. So far, nobody knows what is going to happen, but it's very likely that there was going to be economic problems for quite some time after everything is over. And then there's the problem of people who are living alone, of which there are large numbers of them, and many of them are old people who have been separated from their loved ones, sometimes with not just the emotional difficulties of that situation, but sometimes great loneliness and what have you. And people who happen to have been traveling at the time that this business began, and they're in another country and they're not able to return to their loved ones. So that's the present situation, and it's not a good situation. It's occurred to me that at a time like this, a universal crisis, we see virtually the best and the worst in human beings coming out. I think of the doctors and the nurses and volunteers doing various things who are quite literally putting their health and in some cases their life on the line to do their duty and to help others. And in that sense, that is a really, really wonderful thing. And then there are, here in Australia, there are many elderly people living alone, and groups of people have volunteered to once again spend their time going out to visit these people, to make sure that they've got everything they need, to help to explain to them what they need to do to keep healthy and what have you. And this has happened on a very large scale. People have, on their own initiative, gone out to help others who are not handling the crisis so successfully. And there are also, at least in Australia, and I believe in Singapore, the majority of people have buckled down and done their best to deal with the situation, and most importantly of all, follow as carefully as they can the advice given by the people who know, which is the scientists and the health experts and what have you. And as a result of that, at least here in Australia, the crisis is manageable. Here, I'm living in the northern state of Queensland, and there was one new case a few days ago, and other than that, there hasn't been any cases for quite some time. So this state is nearly as big as Western Europe. So over a huge area, the problem has been controlled. In the southern states, Melbourne and Sydney, things were going very well, and then they decided to tell people that they could open up a little bit, and then the problem came back again, so they've all shut down again. Some of you may know that last month I had a very serious sickness, and I had to go to hospital. And while I was there, I asked the doctors about this, and they told me in the town where I'm living, which is Townsville, there had been 22 cases, and only 2 of them had to be admitted to hospital. All the others were able to stay at home and get better at home, and there had been no deaths. So I'm very, very fortunate to be living in a place where the situation is well under control. And that is mainly due to the fact that people, as I said, buckled down, followed the rules, did what was right, and that helped the authorities successfully deal with the problem. Now, the purpose of this talk is to talk about it from a Buddhist perspective. And I think we've got to be honest here that the Buddha was not a health official, and to the best of our knowledge, he never dealt with a crisis like we're dealing with now. And so really, directly, there's very little in the Dharma that can be directly used or directly relied upon or referred to deal with this problem. In fact, I was looking through the Tipitaka and I could find one or two references to, or possible references to, epidemics. In the Anguttara Nikaya, there's one discourse where a Brahmin comes to the Buddha and asks him, why is there less people now than there was in the past? And the Buddha gives an interesting answer to that question, but I don't want to deal with what the Buddha, how the Buddha explained that anomaly, but the mere fact that apparently, at least some people were aware of the fact that at the time of the Buddha, there was less people than there were in the past. How long ago in the past? I don't know, it doesn't say. But it is very possible that this referred to a plague or something like that, a dreadful plague which had decimated the population sometime before the Buddha, perhaps when he was young. Some of you will also know the famous discourse of the Buddha where he talks about the ancient path. And he says, Dhamma is, it's as if a man was going through a forest and he came across an overgrown path and he followed that path and he came to an ancient city which apparently had been abandoned and overgrown by the jungle. And then he said his Dhamma is like that. That is, that there were great spiritual masters in the past who understood the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, although they may not have expressed those truths in that way, and that the Dhamma had been lost or obscured, and that he, the Buddha of our time, Gautama Buddha, had rediscovered that path. And like the ancient lost city, he had repaired, revised, and had that city inhabited again. Now that's an interesting simile, but it suggests that occasionally some people in India at the time of the Buddha did discover large habitations which had been lived in the past and now were empty. Once again, this is possibly an indirect reference to plagues and what have you, which devastated the country at some point in the past. Other than that, I cannot see any direct reference to anything, to the situation like we're having to deal with now. Indirectly, I think there is quite a lot that the Dhamma could help us with. One sutta that comes to mind is, once again, some of you may know, there is a discourse where the Buddha asks us to consider these several points. And the several points are, now I am healthy, but in the future I may not be healthy. Now I am young and vigorous, in the future I will not be. Now there is sufficient food and the resources we need to live with dignity. That may not be the case in the future. Now the country is at peace. In the future that may not be the case. And finally he says, now the Sangha is united, but that will not be the case, that may not be the case in the future. And then he says, given that, considering these very real possibilities, use the time that you have now, that you are healthy, that you are young, or at least not too old, that your society is at peace, there is sufficient food. We're talking about Singapore here, there's always sufficient food just around the corner. And certainly the Sangha is not united and has not been for many, many centuries, but there are Sanghas that are preserving and disseminating the Dhamma. Given that, we should use the time we have now to practice the Dhamma to the best of our ability, rather than putting it off to the future. And it is interesting to consider, in January this year, none of us, not even the most pessimistic person, could have considered that several months later we would be in the position, not just our country, the whole world is in this crisis. Who could have considered it? None of us. And yet it did happen. So while not trying to be too negative, when this is over, we should keep in mind that the unexpected may very well happen again sometime in the future. It's not likely to be something on an international scale like we have now, but it will certainly is possible to happen to us in our personal lives, or the lives of us and our loved ones. Okay, ill health can strike at any time. We are all destined to become old when practicing the Dhamma becomes more difficult, because we're more set in our ways. It's very unlikely that there would ever be, for any of us, any shortages of food, but having the resources to buy sufficient, losing one's job or something like that, could certainly very well happen. Once again, it is unlikely in our times that there could be civil strife, serious civil strife, or even war in our times, but it is not impossible, because it's happening in some other people's countries right now. Should we be thinking about this all of the time? Probably not. That might not make us very happy. But the idea of being realistic about the future, in order to be properly preparing ourselves in the present, that is very good advice. Beyond that, I think that we can think of this virus and the crisis that is caused in two ways. First of all, in relation to the body, our physical body, and secondly, in relation to the mind, our consciousness. Once again, I don't think that the Dhamma really has very much that it could help us, anything in the suttas that could help us as far as the body is concerned. As far as that is concerned, each of us should, I would say, diligently follow the rules and regulations and the recommendations given by our government, and most of them, it seems to me, take their advice from the best informed and the most knowledgeable health experts. And the things that seem to be emphasized everywhere, certainly in Australia, I'm sure it is in Singapore too, is that if you go out, when you return, wash your hands for at least 3 minutes. The second thing is, if you have to go out, wear a mask, partly to protect yourself, more importantly, if you have the virus, to protect and don't know it, and to protect others that you come into contact with. And the third thing would be what is now called, I don't know what they're calling it in Singapore, but here they're calling it social distancing, keeping a distance of about 6 feet from anybody else. And fourthly, not meeting in large groups beyond, certain numbers. Returning to the idea of that this crisis has brought out the best and the worst in people, we had some situations here in Australia recently where the government had given very strong advice not to meet in large groups, and there was a religious organization, a church, that decided to meet together because they hadn't been able to assemble together in their church for quite some time, and they were determined to do it. They didn't take the advice, and some 12 people in the congregation who had met together got the virus. Fortunately, none of them had become sick enough that they had to go to hospital or that they died. But they don't know whether these people may have spread the virus to people that they had come into contact with. And just now, just a few days ago, they discovered that in the state where I'm living, Queensland, because there's virtually none of the problem here, they have closed the borders, and nobody is allowed to, from the other states where the problem is a bit more serious, people from those states have not been able to come in. And if you do come in, if it's absolutely necessary, you've got to give all your details and be checked and what have you. And they found that 2 young and very stupid girls had come from Melbourne. They went to Sydney, they walked all around the city, then they crossed the border into Queensland and lied, saying that, not giving the correct information. And then they went to a school and they passed the sickness on to several people at school. So unfortunately, following these rules, that is washing one's hands if one's going out, wearing a mask if one goes out, socially distancing if one goes out, only meeting in very small groups if one does meet at all, there will always be probably the majority of people who are responsible enough and intelligent enough to follow those rules, but inevitably there'll always be a few fools who don't. Everybody can be disadvantaged by that if that happens. So that's what we can say about the body. When we talk about the mind, what Buddhism can say about attitudes, outlooks, etc. Of course, this is and always has been the strong point of Buddhism, and there are a few things that we could talk about in relation to the crisis. These are some of the things that have occurred to me over the last few months. The first one is to consider what the Buddha said about the unexpected, and we just talked about this. Health and sickness, peace and conflict, resources and lack of resources, youth and old age. Okay. So here am I sitting in my little house, and while I'm doing that, I've been considering these things that. This has come as a completely unexpected thing to me and to virtually everybody else. And in my case, after having considered that, it occurred to me that my situation has been much more difficult, much more different from many, many other people. Many of those who were listening to me probably had jobs, and either their jobs have disappeared, or that their income has dropped considerably, and that it may drop even more in the future as this problem continues. And I'm very fortunate. I mean, I think about it virtually every day, that because of my situation, I'm retired, I have enough resources to manage, that I am relatively protected from the problems that many others are. Quite apart from the people whose loved ones are critically ill in hospital, and the others whose loved ones may actually have died. And as a result of that, every evening when I do metta meditation, as the final one, I don't think of somebody who I dislike or I don't like at all. I think of all of those who are in dire straits because of this problem. And then I also think of how fortunate that I am that I'm relatively shielded from most of these problems so far. So the first thing is that I've considered this idea of gratitude. Now, there are some of you undoubtedly who are not in my position, whose situation is much more serious. But even then, losing your job is still not as bad as losing your health. And losing your health or becoming unhealthy is not as serious as losing your life. For as long as we are alive and we have at least sufficient food, we're still more fortunate than others. In countries like India, where the health services are not very good at the best of times, and where the situation is such that it's such a huge country where people generally, as a rule, take rules and regulations very casually, the situation has got completely out of hand. And some of you may know that a few years ago, Chitalia and I went to India for a conference. And while we were there, we met a very good friend of mine who happens to be a doctor who works in the Pune hospital. And he contacted me some time ago. This was before the situation got really bad. And he told me that all of the doctors in the hospitals where he is working are bracing for the thousands and thousands of deaths, and his hospital being totally overwhelmed by the numbers. I haven't spoken to him since then. I haven't contacted him since then. I don't want to disturb him, but I know from the news that in many places people are not fortunate enough to live in a country where the health services are relatively good or very good, as in Singapore and Australia, and the government is fairly on the ball of getting the problem under control. How lucky all of us are. Another thing is it's an opportunity to do what I call some attitudinal development. So one of these would be, as I've just spoken, having gratitude for and keeping in mind how fortunate all of us are. A second thing is having some compassion for those who are perhaps in not as such a serious situation as we are. And a third one can be accepting or having acceptance or having patience for what we have to deal with in the present. Once again, I'm not that sure of what's going on in Singapore, but here, if you follow social media, and I have to confess that I have started doing that a bit here, is the people complaining that they can't go out, or that they can't go to the cinema, that they can't play football, or that they can't even watch a football match on the television because all the football matches have been cancelled. Australians really like football. But I find it amazing that people are not able to use their confinement, those who are confined, in constructive ways. And the only thing that I can imagine is that people have never been in this situation before. We are used to doing the things we're wanting, having so many things available for us. A crisis like this comes along and people seem to, or many people seem to have very little acceptance of the situation and very little patience for it. One of the reasons why some of them go out without following the rules and the advice being given by the health authorities. So this would be a time when the Buddhist value of acceptance, that's the way things are. It may be good, it may be bad. We have no say in it. What happens in the future is not, generally, is not in our hands. What happens to me personally, I have some control over. The whole situation, the whole crisis is, there's nothing that I can do about it. So there are two things, the two ways people relate to this. One is that they complain or that they get angry or they... And all that does is compound the unpleasantness and the disadvantages of this situation, of being confined, of not being able to do what one normally does. So in a case like this, in a situation like this, developing the attitude of acceptance where we have no say or minimal control over the situation is by far the most intelligent and helpful thing that you can do. So, and of course, this doesn't mean that one accepts every situation generally, but this would be a case where the situation is such that this is certainly the best thing. Worrying, complaining, refusing to follow the guidelines and the advice only compounds our unpleasantness. Another interesting thing, attitudinal thing that one can do is this, which I think is very interesting. Very frequently when you encourage people to, you teach people meditation and you encourage them to meditate, how often do they say, "I don't have time"? Well, now many people do have time. There's plenty of time for those who are in quarantine, or for those who are confined to their homes, or confined to their homes far more often than they were. And what do? Grumble, complain, etc. Now you do have the time. And this goes back to what the Buddha said before. Now, to take advantage of this situation at present would be able to do something really constructive for yourself. So if you are in that situation, and if you know at least something about meditation, or even just relaxation, now is a wonderful opportunity. You have the time, and hopefully you have at least some instruction in meditation to use this time well. I think that they are the main things, and I would just like to sort of wrap up by talking a little bit about what I'm doing in this situation. You know that in February 2017 I left Singapore. I was in Indonesia for a short time, and then I returned here, and then I stayed with my brother for some months. And he very, very kindly put aside some of his activities to advise me and actually guide me in getting a house, which I eventually was able to do, partly with help from him, partly with because of the generosity of you, so many people in Singapore, and some also in Indonesia. This house was actually built the year after I was born, in 1962. It's a very solid place. The city where I'm living, Townsville, is the second largest city in the state of Queensland. And this is a tornado, what's the word? A cyclone. It's a cyclone area. And this city has been hit by cyclones quite a few times before. And the city, until recently, was growing very quickly. So you have a part of the city which is quite old, in fact, going back over 100 years. But the majority of the city, the houses were built in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And I'm very fortunate that I was able to get an old house. Nobody, or many people, would prefer to have one of these modern, really nice-looking houses. The disadvantages that they have now discovered is that the old houses are built of solid timber and are very, very solid. And they're still around because they generally can survive the cyclones. Whereas the new houses tend to be built much more quickly and of cheaper material and that, and they're the ones that all lose their roofs when the cyclones come. Now, I didn't choose this particular house for that reason, but it is wonderful, or very fortunate of me that I did. One of the disadvantages of this place is one thing I didn't think of when I decided to buy this house was that it's on a main road. And just after we started, you may have heard a siren. That's because there's a hospital nearby, and the ambulances go up and down the road maybe once or twice a day. So and I was really looking forward to leaving Ballastair Road, where it is very, very noisy, and I found, unfortunately, I'm living in a place that's almost as noisy. Nonetheless, I have complete privacy. There are shops nearby where I can buy the things I need. I'm very, very fortunate in that on both sides, but particularly on this side, my neighbor, a woman who works from home, has been extremely friendly and helpful, and we have become very good friends. And having neighbors that you get along with rather than those that you don't have any contact with, or perhaps you have conflicts with, is a real blessing. She is a very, very nice woman, and we get along very well together. I have a pension which allows me to at least have basic things, and so this has given me a tremendous amount of time where I can do what I want. And what I have been able to do is nowadays I spend at least 2 hours every day on a regular basis meditating. Other time I spend, as you know, I've accumulated a very large library, and I have not read all of those. I have not read all of those books. Now I have the opportunity to read them all. The other thing I do is writing. At present, I am coming towards the end of a book that I have been writing since 2017, and I hope to have it finished at the end of this year. And it has been a wonderful adventure to me, because once again I have gone through the Tipitaka, the Buddhist scriptures, in great detail, selecting information primarily about the life of the Buddha. And this book will be the Buddha as described in the Pali Tipitaka, rather than in the various legends and stories that grew up around him. And then the other thing that I do is I have a very small garden, which is always a delight to have a small garden. I've managed to grow some quite lovely flowers and what have you, and this is what I do. So my schedule every day is I wake up roughly about 4. I don't specifically time myself, but I find myself my body clock wakes me up about 4 o'clock. I just do go to the toilet and wash my face and what have you, and then I meditate for an hour. And once again, I don't time myself, but I find that for the most part, I feel that an hour has gone past, and I get up and I look at the clock and I find that it has been about an hour. And these are the meditation, and then I do that in the evening time also. And this is the meditation that I do now. I do really only 2 types of meditation. The first one is mindfulness of breathing. I find it peaceful, calming, etc., simply to sit and watch as my breath moves in and out. Because I can go for several days without talking, I found that my mind has quietened a great deal, and that within 3 or 4 minutes of meditating, I have very, very few thoughts. And that I've got to the stage where when those thoughts come, I simply observe them and they simply disappear. And so roughly in the second half of my meditation, roughly half an hour, I can go for extended periods with total silence. And I describe the state like this, is that I am fully aware of everything that's going on around me, but it has no impact upon me at all. There is just a simple registering of that experience. And basically a clean, spacious emptiness within my mind. So I've got to the state where I think this might be described as some sort of jhanic state, although I hesitate to use that term. Then it sometimes happens in that state. Sometimes there is, my mood is elevated. I'm not sure exactly how to explain it, but that spacious emptiness is filled with joy. And there are times that is intense, and it comes sort of like in waves. But normally it is just what I would call joyful. And then I take that opportunity, when that happens, I'm fully aware of that, because that's another of the experiences that I register. And then I decide to, at that time, either sit and just enjoy the joy, or I do metta bhavana. And I found that this has been extremely fruitful. And sometimes I do it for like 15 or 20 minutes. And then giving a blessing to myself, a loved person or loved persons, neutral persons, disliked persons. And then, as I said before, sometimes thinking of those specific individuals or people in general who are not as fortunate and as blessed as I am, and I extend metta towards them too. And I found that the combination of doing that on a regular basis, together with virtually doing no talking at all. I mean, I'm talking a lot now. You might think that I talk all the time, but it's actually not true. And in fact, some time ago, I realized, I made a note of how much, and I found out it was 8 days before I'd actually spoken to anybody other than myself. I registered that shaving one day, that I started talking to myself as I was shaving. But other than that, no talking whatsoever. Now, most of you may not be in the fortunate situation that I am in, but it is certainly quite possible that you'll have more time than you had before. And I would certainly encourage you, if you have at least even a basic knowledge of meditation, to take advantage, seeing as there's nothing else that you can do, or there's very little that you can do, to use any time you have, either just to be in silence or to cultivate an inner silence through doing simple and basic meditation. I think that's about all I have to say for this afternoon. And I'd just like to finish by saying that let's hope that this crisis is over soon and we can go back to normal. And that when we do, we will not forget what has happened to us, and do our best to prepare ourselves should something like this happen to us again. It's unlikely to happen on such a scale, but it's quite possible to happen to us as individuals. And I hope all of you who have listened will be able to maintain your good health and your safety over the next few months as this thing works itself out. Okay, that's all I have got to say.
Thank you, Bhante.